The ridge line beyond the valley had been quiet for most of the morning, a deceptive calm that settled over the men like a heavy blanket. The artillery battery had been operating for weeks without rest, firing mission after mission across terrain that shifted with every new report. Weather, smoke, and enemy movement made each calculation a puzzle, and yet the gunners kept pushing forward, adjusting, firing, and adjusting again. But accuracy had dropped sharply over the past days, and nobody could fully explain why. The commander blamed wind drift, the forward observers blamed poor visibility, the crews blamed worn barrels, bent sights, and rushed firing orders. Every shell that landed wide felt like a personal failure. They were not missing by miles but by yards, and in artillery, yards could be catastrophic. Yards could decide whether a position fell or held, whether infantry advanced or dug in deeper, whether a mission succeeded or collapsed. At the center of this problem was a single quiet artilleryman who had been tracking accuracy trends in a small, battered notebook. He was not senior, not high-ranking, and certainly not someone expected to innovate. He was simply known as the man who checked fuses twice, who timed burn lengths 3 times, who ran calculations nobody asked him to run. Most of the battery saw him as overly cautious, even obsessive, but he studied every variable with attention that bordered on fixation. He had noticed something subtle, a pattern hidden in the misfires. The shells were not simply drifting wide, they were drifting in a consistent curve, almost as if each fuse delay was slightly unpredictable. The pattern repeated itself across different guns, different crews, and different targets. The drift occurred when humidity spiked or when the temperature dropped. It occurred when barrels heated beyond normal operating cycles. It occurred when the enemy barrage forced rapid counterfire. The pattern bothered him deeply. Artillery was never perfect, but this deviation felt unnatural. He knew the regulation-approved fuse settings. He knew the timing windows and the conditions under which fuses should be inspected. But something in the design, something in the standard procedure, was breaking under battlefield pressure. The fuse's internal mechanism simply did not burn at a perfectly constant rate during extreme conditions. The artilleryman realized the measured burn time on paper and the actual burn time in live combat were no longer matching. His mind circled the problem again and again, searching for a point of intervention, some way to bring stability back to the curve. The most dangerous idea came to him only after watching 3 shells detonate early during a coordinated fire mission. The fuses had been set identically, and yet their detonation timing differed. The observers reported the shells were landing too shallow into the target zone, bursting in air instead of ground impact. The artilleryman saw the same curve again, the same drift, the same unreliable burn. He started testing ignition delays in small controlled setups during the few minutes of downtime the battery had. When the rest of the crew rested, he quietly measured fuse behavior in the shade of an ammunition truck. He looked for differences between warm and cool fuses, between fuses stored near heat sources and those kept in the open. He charted every second, every half-second, building a model no one had asked him to build. His work revealed something that changed everything. The fuse coating absorbed moisture unevenly. A thin layer beneath the outer casing expanded in high humidity, causing tiny inconsistencies in how quickly the ignition compound burned. It was a microscopic effect, but when scaled across hundreds of meters, it shifted entire impact zones. The official manuals did not mention this. The manufacturing notes did not mention this. Yet this tiny flaw could explain the drift that had plagued them all week. He knew what needed to be done, he knew what could fix the problem, but the solution forming in his mind was reckless, unapproved, and technically forbidden. It required altering how the fuse vented pressure, adjusting the internal channel in a way that would stabilize airflow and prevent moisture-driven burn irregularities. It was simple, elegant, and deeply against regulation. He hesitated, thinking through consequences. Fuse integrity was sacred. Modifying one could lead to court-martial if discovered, but not modifying them, not addressing the flaw would cost accuracy, cost missions, and cost lives. A choice had to be made, and he made it quietly without telling anyone. He took a fuse aside and began carving a microscopic groove along a rarely touched edge of the internal casing. It was barely visible, yet that tiny alteration changed airflow through the fuse by just enough to give the burn a stable, predictable curve. He repeated the modification 3 times for confirmation. Then he applied it to a full set of fuses used by his gun crew. The first test shot landed precisely where predicted. The second landed within the margin of error. The third struck exactly on the observer's coordinate mark. The drift vanished, the accuracy curve flattened. The change was unmistakable. He had discovered a forbidden hack that doubled accuracy on the spot. But now he had to keep it quiet. If the battery commanders knew he was modifying fuses, everything he had just achieved could collapse into disciplinary action. He worked quickly, discreetly, applying the modification to as many fuses as he could without drawing attention. Within an hour, his gun team's accuracy surpassed every other crew on the ridge. The forward observers noticed. Reports filtered upward. Someone on the ridge had suddenly become impossibly accurate, adjusting fire with uncanny consistency. When questioned, the artilleryman simply said the conditions were stabilizing. No one suspected the truth. The artillery crews along the ridge had no margin for experimentation. Every round had to count, every fuse had to behave exactly as expected, and every adjustment had to be logged and approved. That was the doctrine, that was the discipline, and that was precisely why Corporal Harlan's idea was not only discouraged but officially forbidden. But the war did not care about doctrine. The targets in the valley were small, fast-moving, and dug into broken terrain. Standard fuses with their factory-set delay times simply weren't producing reliable results. Some shells detonated too early, blossoming into bursts of smoke before they even reached the enemy trenches. Others buried themselves too deep, going off underground where the effect was drastically reduced. The margin of error was measured not in seconds, but in fractions of them, and each fraction meant the difference between a suppressed enemy line and a fully operational one. Harlan had seen the problem during the previous artillery mission. He'd watched through binoculars as the rounds detonated erratically along the hillside, leaving gaps in the fire pattern where enemy squads continued to maneuver freely. When the forward observers radioed back requesting a tighter impact cluster, the Fire Direction Center simply repeated the same calculations, using the same fuse settings, hoping the next volley would behave better than the last. It didn't. The patterns remained unpredictable, drifting left or right, either bursting above the slopes or disappearing into the soil before sending up a muted plume. The observers described the outcome as inconsistent at best. The officers accepted it. The manuals anticipated it, but Harlan refused to. During one quiet break between salvos, while the rest of the battery cleaned their equipment or caught their breath, he crouched beside the fuse crates and studied the construction of the delay mechanisms. He knew the internal design well enough: a timed channel, a calibrated burn rate, and a tiny spring-loaded striker waiting to trigger detonation. The components were delicate, but the principle behind them was simple. Control the delay, and you control the detonation point. The problem, as he saw it, was that the factory settings were designed for average conditions. Flat terrain, standard air density, predictable target depth. None of those conditions existed on the valley floor below. The terrain was layered, uneven, full of shattered tree trunks and improvised fortifications. The enemy moved between ridges and trenches that didn't appear on any map, throwing off every standard calculation. For Harlan, this wasn't a malfunction, it was a mismatch. The fuses weren't broken, they simply weren't built for the scenario being forced upon them. What he considered next was not authorized. It wasn't even remotely within his duties. But the longer he watched the pattern of impacts drift wider, the more certain he became that a precise solution existed, and that no one else was going to attempt it. He turned the fuse over in his hands, studying the tiny adjustment ring that was meant to remain fixed. A thin metal plate sealed it into place, preventing any alteration outside a controlled maintenance shop. But Harlan knew how thin that plate was. He also knew that a careful twist, no more than a millimeter, could change the delay time just enough to shift detonation closer to the ideal point of effect. He didn't need a new fuse. He didn't need a replacement design. All he needed was a correction, a tiny one. As the distant artillery thundered from another battery along the ridge, he reached into his pocket and removed a small steel tool he'd fashioned earlier for maintenance. It wasn't designed for modification, but he understood the pressure tolerances well enough to avoid damaging the mechanism. He positioned the tool along the edge of the fuse housing, took one steady breath, and applied gentle rotational force. The plate flexed. The adjustment ring shifted, no more than a fraction of a turn, but enough to shorten the delay by a measurable amount. He examined the fuse carefully, checking alignment marks, making sure the striker channel remained intact. When he was satisfied that the unit still functioned as intended, just slightly faster, he set it aside and prepared to adjust another. A shadow fell over him. One of the senior gunners had returned to retrieve more fuses. His eyes narrowed when he noticed the open housings on the crate and the tool in Harlan's hand. There was no anger, just a silent understanding of what this meant: unauthorized modification, violation of maintenance protocol, potential disciplinary action. But the senior gunner didn't reach for an officer. He didn't confiscate the tool. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, he glanced toward the valley where the enemy positions were regrouping under the cover of smoke, and then down at the altered fuse. After a long moment, he simply asked quietly, "How sure are you?" Harlan didn't exaggerate. He didn't promise perfection. He simply replied with the single truth he believed with absolute certainty. "Sure enough." The senior gunner nodded. "Load it into the next round." The decision was unofficial, unrecorded, and entirely against regulation. But in that moment, the need for accuracy outweighed everything else: policy, procedure, and punishment. The artillery battery had a mission to complete, and if one corporal's adjustment could provide the precision they lacked, then so be it. The next round was loaded. The breech locked. The coordinates remained unchanged. The firing command echoed across the ridge. The gun recoiled, launching the shell into the sky with a thunderous report that rolled across the valley like distant thunder. Harlan watched its arc, knowing that the moment of detonation would confirm everything or nothing. A few seconds passed, another heartbeat, then another. And when the shell burst, it did so exactly where the forward observers had hoped: not too high, not too deep, but directly above the enemy trench line. The observation post radioed in almost immediately. They saw the cluster tighten, they saw the pattern sharpen, they saw the shells behave consistently for the first time all morning. They didn't know why. No one did, except the two men standing beside the gun. The senior gunner's silence was not approval, but neither was it rejection. It was acknowledgement. What Harlan had done was reckless, unauthorized, and undeniably effective. And he knew this was only the beginning. Because if one tiny adjustment could correct a single shell, then refining the method could correct every shell the battery fired. The days that followed the first improvised test were defined by a quiet tension that spread across the battery like smoke that refused to lift. No official report was filed, no written acknowledgement existed, but every man in the position understood that something unusual had happened. They had all seen the impact pattern shift from scattered, inconsistent bursts to a grouping that, by artillery standards, looked unnervingly precise. The crews operated as they always did, checking spades, scraping breech blocks, rotating through ammunition drills. But beneath the familiar routine lay a growing awareness that one gun was behaving differently. No one voiced it openly, not yet, but several men found small excuses to remain near Harding's gun whenever possible, offering to help load or assist with sighting, all in hopes of witnessing something without risking the accusation of gossip. Harding did not seek the attention. If anything, he seemed more cautious. He worked with the same patient, methodical rhythm he displayed long before making the adjustment. He cleaned the same surfaces, paced the same distances, and double-checked the same components. Nothing in his outward behavior suggested he had done anything extraordinary, but his careful silence was a signal in itself. It was the silence of someone who understood the weight of a discovery before anyone else did. The next opportunity for indirect fire came sooner than expected. A coordinated call arrived from a forward observer positioned several hundred meters ahead, reporting intermittent movement behind a berm that shielded a supply lane. The enemy rarely risked daytime activity in that zone, but something had changed in their routine. Whether they were moving ammunition, repositioning anti-tank teams, or preparing an immediate assault, the battery did not know. They only knew that the observer's tone carried an urgency that required action. The battery chief repeated the instructions down the line. Each gun crew stepped into their practiced roles, shifting from routine maintenance to operational readiness. Harding's crew reacted as they always did, professionally, efficiently, without wasted motion. But this time, one small difference separated them from their neighboring teams. Harding reached for the fuse crate before the loader did. He removed the lid himself, selecting the shells not by exterior markings, but by the small tolerances he had memorized through weeks of quiet observation. His hands moved without hesitation, but without flourish. He set aside the standard configuration in favor of the adjusted method he had pieced together slowly, from fragments of theory, practice, and the instincts of a man who had spent too many hours listening to shells detonate slightly earlier or later than intended. There was no time for experimentation now. The procedure had already been tested once. He simply repeated what he knew would produce a consistent timing window. The adjustment remained small, almost invisible, but he applied it with the certainty of someone who understood that consistency, not genius, was what the battery lacked most. When the forward observer sent the final confirmation, the battery chief issued the fire order. The line burst into coordinated motion. Breeches slammed, shells seated, charges checked. Harding's gun fired in perfect sequence with the others, its recoil pressing deep into the mud as the shell disappeared behind a rolling curtain of smoke. Seconds passed, then the observer's voice returned over the radio. His report came slower this time, as if he needed an additional moment to confirm what he was seeing. The other guns, as expected, produced a spread, not inaccurate but not decisive. Their bursts impacted along predictable but dispersed lines, forcing the enemy to scatter instead of pinning them in place. Harding's round, however, landed cleanly, so cleanly that the observer initially assumed another battery had joined the mission. The burst was almost centered on the berm's blind side, precisely where the movement had been detected. There was no drift, no late detonation, no elongated delay caused by moisture or shell vibration. The explosive effect occurred exactly when and where the forward observer intended. The observer asked which gun had fired last. The battery chief answered without thinking, but as soon as he confirmed the number, he fell silent. So did several of the men within earshot. This was not coincidence. It was now a pattern forming too clearly to ignore. The fire mission continued. More shells followed. The difference grew sharper with each round. Harding's impacts fell within a remarkably narrow radius, while the remaining guns maintained their standard dispersion pattern. No crew was performing poorly. The difference was not skill, it was something else, something fundamental. By the time the observer declared the objective neutralized, the battery chief had already made the decision to pull Harding aside. He waited until the men resumed their post-action routines, wiping tools, cooling barrels, and stacking unused charges. Only then did he call Harding to a quiet corner behind the ammunition stacks. Harding did not feign confusion. He simply stood with the calm expression he always carried. The chief asked one question. Harding responded with an explanation that was neither boastful nor defensive. It was factual, rooted in the mechanical principles he had studied long before enlisting. He outlined exactly what he had done, why he had done it, and the conditions that made it effective. The chief listened closely. He did not interrupt. When the explanation ended, he exhaled slowly. Harding's adjustment was not reckless improvisation. It was careful analysis of fuse tolerances, shell vibrations, ignition delays, and environmental drift, details most artillerymen acknowledged but seldom explored. The chief said nothing more. He simply placed a hand on Harding's shoulder and instructed him to keep the discovery quiet until they understood its full implications. Then he walked away, leaving Harding alone with the realization that his quiet modification would not remain quiet for long. The battery did not change overnight, but its understanding had. Every gun crew sensed it, and every man knew the next engagement would prove whether the improvement was situational, skill-based, or structural. They returned to their tents that night without celebration, without concern, but with an awareness that they were now part of a process that could reshape how their fire missions were executed. Harding, sitting alone at the edge of the position, cleaned his tools in silence. The final light of the day drifted across the gun line, catching the metallic edges of the equipment. He continued working, steady and meticulous, while the first hints of a question formed quietly in the minds of everyone who had watched the day unfold. The field reports that followed the test were unusually direct for wartime paperwork. The observers noted that the first 2 volleys landed closer to the target than any previous attempt recorded in that battery. The spread pattern on the ground, normally wide and inconsistent, had tightened into something that looked almost deliberate. It was not perfection, but it was control, something artillery crews rarely felt when the weather refused to cooperate. Still, the battery commander refused to attribute the improvement to anything other than coincidence. Weather changed by the minute. Humidity varied between valleys. Nothing was stable enough to declare a breakthrough, but Mitchell insisted the test be repeated. He had spent enough years around artillery to recognize when a result wasn't an accident. The men loaded a second sequence of shells. The forward observer prepared his field glasses again, this time with a more focused interest. The second sequence fell even closer, not by a dramatic margin but by a measurable one. 6 shells landed within the same concentrated zone where normally only one might have landed. The forward observer, who had not been informed of the experiment, asked whether a different crew had taken over the guns. He said the pattern looked like the work of a unit that had drilled together for months, not hours. Mitchell said nothing. He only asked for a third test. The commander agreed, though reluctantly. If the results turned out to be coincidence, the tests would expose it. If they didn't, the reports would force the regiment to take the findings seriously. The guns were reloaded, the calculations repeated, and the modified fuses placed into the steel casings with the same quiet precision that had defined Mitchell's entire career. When the final volley went out, it did so under complete silence among the crew. The forward observer's call came back slower this time. He asked the commander whether something unusual had been done to the guns. The shells, he said, had all landed in a line so narrow that the smoke plumes looked almost arranged. The difference was visible even from his ridge. It was not skill, it was not luck. It was a change in the way the shells behaved once they left the barrel. Mitchell finally explained his method in full, though he kept his tone even and unembellished. He described how the weather the day before had caused an entire fire mission to drift badly off course. He described how he had examined the fuses afterward, noticing how their timing shifts varied under temperature and pressure changes. And he explained, step by step, how he had created a correction that neutralized part of that instability. The commander did not interrupt. When Mitchell finished, he simply asked whether the modification could be repeated safely. Mitchell answered that the modification did not increase the risk to the crew, provided the adjustments were consistent and carefully measured. He had tested the theory in the field without formal approval, but he was confident in its stability. The metal casings tolerated the change. The fuse mechanisms responded predictably. The commander ordered a full review. The regiment's senior ordnance officer examined Mitchell's work the same evening. He confirmed the components were unaltered structurally. The modification was small, precise, and reversible. It did not push the shell outside operating limits. It did not compromise the firing sequence. What it did, however, was reduce the unpredictable drift that plagued long-range fire under unstable weather conditions. The regiment approved broader testing within 48 hours. Surrounding batteries were instructed to replicate the modification across several controlled missions. Some crews reacted with skepticism. Others treated the idea as another improvised wartime experiment that would be forgotten in a week. But when the test volleys came in, the results repeated themselves with a consistency that startled even experienced officers. The dispersion zones on the mapping boards began shrinking. Lines of impact that once curved awkwardly across the landscape tightened into narrower patterns. Forward observers rotated between positions, checking the results at different distances and elevations to rule out coincidence. Each of them reported the same strange improvement. For the first time since the regiment had engaged in sustained operations, they felt they could account for weather without guessing. The gunners still relied on mathematics, training, and instinct, but Mitchell's modification provided a stabilizing influence that nothing else had delivered in the field. Word of the results reached divisional headquarters by the end of the week. Reports were forwarded further up the chain under routine administrative channels, but they carried a quiet urgency. It was not a dramatic invention. It was not a breakthrough that required factories or redesigns. It was a practical correction, a small mechanical insight that improved the reliability of every shot in every condition without adding cost or complexity. Mitchell continued working in silence as the evaluation proceeded. He did not speak about the results, and he did not accept congratulations. The crews around him began to view him differently, not because of admiration, but because of clarity. They finally understood that his habit of examining spent casings, collecting fragments, and studying the fuse interiors had not been idle curiosity. It had been years of quiet observation accumulating toward a single adjustment that no one else had thought to make. When the regiment finally received permission to apply the modification formally across all batteries, it did so without ceremony. The war did not pause for recognition. The front lines shifted daily. Missions went out through rain, wind, and temperature swings that had once made the guns feel unreliable.